I'll press the record. So in this session, we'll start with two examples. This is me doing an intro for all the people who were listening earlier. That kind of provide this sort of different snapshots of the possibilities of tokens and kind of maybe open, or I think they should open certain considerations of what actually tokens are and what you can do with them. But to start that, I'll do again the sharing of the screen and start with this, which is Isle of Skye, a board game. I can show you a kind of general picture here to give you kind of like a lay of the land, so to speak, which is, I'm using the literal in this case. So Isle of Skye is a kind of map making game for clan ground. That's the metaphor. So what each clan here, each player has just one tile in front of them, but towards the end of the game, they will turn, each one of them will turn into this sort of patch of land like this. And they happen tile by tile that you get tiles, and then you decide how you place them. But the reason why you place them is essentially, like, ultimately it's victory points, but really it's tokens, because that decides, that's the main culprit of the victory points in and of themselves, that you use to give yourself the reasons of how you and where you place the land. But how the game works in a very summary fashion is that you have, first of all, the starting point. I think we'll see this in this map as well. It's here. I don't know if you see my cursor. I do, actually.
Yes.
Good. So
Where the castle is.
yeah. So this is your starting tile, and it has this sort of 5 token sign, which means that every turn, including the first turn, you will issue 5 tokens. Um, um, and that creates the kind of initial setup. You have 1 tile, you have 5 tokens. But from there, we come to the main engine of the game, which is, it is a kind of a market, but in a wider sense. It's also definitely an offer mechanic. It's an auction as well, but like it's a sort of a different auction and an interesting auction structure in itself, to which I will kind of concentrate on, because I think it kind of points out several good starting points towards the token. So on each of the turns, each player gets 3 random tiles, which you see in the front of the shield. Like, well, you should use the mouse. Here's the shield, and here's the 3 different tiles here. So these are randomly picked from a bag. But of course, but some of the tiles might be more worth to you. They might fit better to your starting tile. Like you can see here, every mountain has to connect to mountain, every grassland has to connect to grassland, every water has to connect to water. So you can only place something that has water here, and so on. But beyond that, like you can see, for example, here, there is a bunch of caskets, which is whiskey in this game, a symbol of such. And then there's 1 token. And because there is a road to the castle from this casket, once this is placed, you generate not just 5 tokens, but 6 tokens every turn. So this is the main idea of the game. Of course, the same happens here and here. But beyond that, I'll zoom in because it's a little bit small, but the image resolution should. Each game selects also random goals, which is like you get other points from things like this. These are all actually tiles, these 4 here. They can be changed. But I'll take, for example, this one, which is easy, which is for every player that has the most ships in their connected land, they get 5 victory points. for now, let's not concentrate on the victory points tokens difference, because the tokens really generate the victory points mostly. And then the second player gets 2. But then there's other conditions and there's many of these. This is, for example, related to cows or and their connections, and then like 3-column and 4-column lands and things like this. They can be really anything. They can also be seas, like if you surround, this is considered like a full area, and you can only score full areas, like this is a whole lake, so you can score this. And so, for example, if the ships are a point condition, once you close this, you have 4 ships. If you don't close them, like here, you don't score that ship, and so on. So this makes the different tiles of different value, and you are now, like, each player get for this market you get these 3 random tokens. So how it works is from there is that once you have your 3 tokens, you can set secretly a price for them. So you can actually see it here. This is actually a setup. So the player has set a starting price or meeting price for this token, which is 2. It's here. For this token, I think it's 6, because there's a 5 token underneath, it's bigger. And for this, they have set the X, which means discard that. So nobody gets this token. So once all the prices are set, each player on their turn has right to match that price that has been set. Like, for example, if one player decides to put 2 tokens on this, they buy it and you don't get it. On the other hand, if none of the players after the round of them makes an offer for this particular token that has 6, you get it, but you pay the 6. For the one that they made the offer, this one, you actually get the 2 that they offered, so you're getting more tokens. And in this case, because you set the high starting price, you kind of want to keep it yourself, but also you have to pay this 6 then if nobody makes an offer for it. So this creates the kind of basic loop of your, first of all, like, of course, considering the play possibilities where you can place them, etc., of the tokens. But then the key thing is you want to and you translate that to a value. Like, I have now 10 tokens, so I think I can afford to put like the price of 4 here, and then because I know I have to pay it if I get it. And for this, I kind of want it, but I'm not sure, so I put 2 here. And this I want to discard because this other player, seeing their patch of land, might want it. So and so on and so forth. So this is the basic loop of the game. You generate tokens from things like the castle, other things like the whiskey barrels, etc. And then you utilize those to set prices, purchase, meet others' offers of tokens if you really want them, and then you use that to build the kind of land which kind of meets up with different conditions that are considered by the particular game valuable. So, for example, because this is here, ships are valuable. If this would not be here, ships wouldn't be valuable, and you would not build towards them. So that's the key point. There are other these sort of build land from placing tiles games like Carcassonne, but here, like, the tokens have been introduced as this sort of way of creating nuance by this sort of consideration of value, that there's a nuance between 4 and 6 or 5 and 6 and whatever the number is. And for me, this kind of outlines to kind of finish this, uh, that there is a kind of uh, it's actually very close to certain elements, at least, that we have put for money in society. First of all, what the token does, it universalizes things. Cows, ships, rivers, etc. All of them turn to tokens, which is, of course, what euros and dollars do. But secondly, they also offer this sort of yes, quantity, but in quantity, this sort of nuance of like 5 is bigger than 6, maybe just slightly. But they turn into conditions. Like somebody thinks like, oh, they're asking 6 for this, I'm not going to take that. Versus, oh, they're asking 5, I might take it, etc. And these kind of structures in themselves, like form, of course, similar loops than they have in normal economy. But we have also other things going on here, like this game in its like issues the tokens in from the game. They don't come from a central bank or banks giving loans, but rather the game mechanics are thinking what is interesting for every player. So every player starts from an equal position, for example. Everybody gets 5 tokens. And then it's about how they build that kind of expands those amounts of tokens. There's other mechanisms which we don't go too much in details. It actually has this sort of rubber band mechanism that every player that is behind others in tokens will get one extra token in later turns. These parts are describing turns to bring players closer in economy. So it's designing the economy to be interesting precisely because it thinks that if the players fall too far behind, they lose the motivation in the game, which we can now translate to society. So therefore, we introduce this sort of uh, rubber band that pulls them back if they're too far behind. So they're getting extra tokens on that. But also the key thing is like everything is included in the same design, from the issuance to your right of valuation. Like you can like you have this right of giving these random tokens certain offers, your right of making offers to others, and then of course your right to place the tiles, etc. So all of them are kind of comprised in the same economy in itself. Maybe that's good for introduction. Like I have some other issues, but I think I've talked long enough on that. So any comments, questions so far?
I'm just at Campi, so I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
What I would like to understand is what you said earlier, that the token doesn't come from a central bank, but it comes rather from inside the game. So that's like if you could, because the token still in, like if I look at the situation of the game in in its practical material detail, the tokens would probably in the beginning lay somewhere outside of the game board, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in the box or something, and then they are lifted onto the playing field. So what would then in your definition a scenario look like where the tokens are coming from a central bank, like as I understood it, like an external entity, if this situation that I just described is not an external source?
Yeah, I think my description was too coarse, but tried to be short. But I think the question is really good because I wouldn't consider central bank an external source. It's more like if the whole world's economy is a game, there is this particular source that has been designed that is kind of like the central bank is. It has certain rules, certain rights, etc. But the difference I was trying to make, which I can maybe put more clearly, which is that here every player becomes a source of issuance. Like the fact that you have a castle, really that's just a symbol, but the point is you get 5 tokens every turn because you have a castle. So you're the issuer. You're doing what the central bank is doing. You're the player, you're also a source of issuance. Now you can extend that issuance by adding this different things, different tiles on the map, and but those tokens issue to you. They start from you, like immediately when they're issued. And like, of course, this is precisely pointing out that there's millions of, well, infinite amount, practical infinity of amounts of different designs you could have here. Of course, you could design a game that has a central bank, even like you're playing a game and then there's one player who decides that how is the state of the play and decide how many tokens they will issue, and it's completely up to their control. And then they take offers from players which they decide upon how much they give them tokens. So I kind of squeezed banks and central banks now together but following a similar model, and that would be a kind of micro version of a central bank inside a game. But now we are already talking design. We're not talking like this is just how money appears. In every case, we're talking about design, and once we're talking about design, we're also talking about, okay, why did we design this? And or we can consider, why did we design this? What are the qualities that we're looking from it?
Thank you. Good. I have a follow-up question, but maybe then what you just said leads to another point rather than going deeper on this.
Yeah, if others have questions or comments or whatever, go ahead. If we can start from that, but if not, we can turn back to Martin.
Can you say again what exactly the tokens are in this game?
Well, that's a good question as well. Like, I think it's almost like a philosophical question. Like, it's a can of worms, because like in this game, like ultimately they are the main reason you win, even though there is victory points. But that actually, I think a better design from here, it would be just the tokens, because the tokens are actually just the main reason for the victory point. But from that, I would say like that there is this like in this game world, they are kind of reason to play. Of course, the reason is given as you can win through this. Of course, you could approach the game that in a way that you don't even want to win and play differently. But generally, like conventionally, players do that. But beyond that, they are a practical carrier of right. Because let's say somebody made an offer that for a tile, change the picture, like here for 2 tokens. Now, you holding tokens gives you the right to think, will you get this land or not? It requires you to offer 2 tokens. But if you have, say, 6, you can do that. If you have 1, you cannot do that. But they become this sort of nuance of rights, because like, let's say you have 30 tokens for some reason. The 2 is a smaller price anyway for you to pay. This is limited in other ways. For example, whenever this round of offers happens, you can only make 1 offer. So even if you have a lot of money or a lot of tokens, you can only make 1 offer, and which is the same as, say, a person with less, or player with less tokens. So, like, this is precisely actually kind of why this is a can of worms. And this is a question we'll face again and again today, is that actually I think tokens are ultimately semiotic. That is, they are like signs. But they form a rather differently functioning semiotic system, saying compared to words or concepts. And but they do communicate, and they allow for certain communications. Those communications also allow to design rituals. Like, for example, like I design a ritual of an offer and a purchase or things like this. But why are they semiotic is because they also have this sort of qualities that whenever tokens are connected to something, just like a sign is connected to some real world thing, they show some expression of value. Just like a concept connected to, say, a cat. If somebody says a cat is elegant, shows an expression again of some association. In the token case, it's an expression associated with this sort of value and the system of that, but in the case of concepts, it's a different kind of association. Nevertheless, both are about meaning ultimately. So I think this is true in this game. Of course, it turns into all these systems, but underneath those systems, it's communicating to us. And that communication here enables play, play that is kind of mirroring something of general economy in a nutshell fashion.
I'm wondering if you're aware, probably you are, of the Georgism economic theory, Georgist economy theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some mechanics that remind me of that, particularly the offer system.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not super knowledgeable about it, but I do remember there's like this way they argue it's very efficient that you sort of like price your land according to the revenue you get from it. So then you're like always pricing it fairly because there's always the opportunity for someone to buy it for you, so you wouldn't overprice it. I don't remember exactly how it works, but maybe it could be interesting to analyze this economy through that perspective. Is that useful?
I mean, potentially, yeah, and that could be a kind of branch way for maybe looking at some point in some I think overall, like often these economies come with arguments, like for example, the argument that we say that this happens, like we say that the price is always sensible because of this. That argument is not necessarily true. Like it's and this is of course rife with current economies, that there's a lot of explanations of why things are in the way they are, which actually don't apply. That there is a kind of a naive belief in the kind of competition, for example, and but like this is a kind of two-sided of things. Like it, all the all the economy that we have ultimately contains some kind of a system. It's a very often vague and very large networked system in itself, but it is a system design. And the arguments are kind of separate from that. Then there is the practicality, for example, that competition is actually a much more complicated question, say in market economies, like that they can, for example, market economies lead to monopolies often, because once somebody gets ahead, they often get more and more ahead, and that is the kind of pathway to a monopoly-like structures. I'm not sure about that argument in itself, like that this always keeps the price low. But here, actually, the interesting thing is it's more from the practicality, because in a way, keeping a player motivated and keeping, say, a citizen or a person motivated in economy is kind of similar question. But here, yes, you can create like right in the back of the board game that this is fun and whatever. But ultimately, it's actually the kind of pragmatics of it that will rule out, like if people actually find it interesting or not. Not just fun, but interesting. And in this sense, I think it's a kind of healthy situation in terms of considering economies. Like there's a lot of other things that complicate this, but nevertheless, like that is actually not starting from what is the principles or what is the things that people try to make people believe. It's really like whether the player finds the game interesting in itself. And of course here the tokens and the kind of thinking in value or translating whatever you seem or feel motivated towards, like a particular tile is translated into value, that has to be motivating. Otherwise the game does not work. Not for everybody, but many players. Otherwise, yeah, it's not being played. Um, so, but so yeah, it's coming to these questions of why do we have tokens in the first place, and why do we have, which is also the same questions, why do we have money in the first place? I consider money kind of a subclass of this sort of wide concept of tokens. And I do think this kind of game points to both that they have certain strengths, but they also have qualities that are like those strengths are limited by also weaknesses. But there's this key consideration, which is both the strength and the weakness, which is about thinking in quantities offers this sort of shared semiotic of value, and that is an extra to just say using concepts. But it's also a limiting factor because the more the value becomes the dominant. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think I interrupted you. It was just because my signal was breaking up.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me right now?
Yeah. Now it's better.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I think I'm not going to go ahead because I see the connection is very low. Please just continue.
It's fine now. Like it might be the connection. It's usually about 10 to 20 seconds late what you're seeing in the connection.
Okay. Well, I will try. Just because I think I missed it due to an earlier connection lapse.
Mm-hmm.
If there is a kind of 5 or 10 second a recap of this kind of negative feedback loop or this kind of rubber band that you just described, that particular element in the game, if you could just recap that would be nice.
Okay, so the rubber band, like this was currently not the rubber band. The rubber band is kind of like when somebody is behind, they are being pulled back, and if somebody's ahead, they are being kind of pulled towards the center. That's kind of that's the definition of a rubber band mechanic. The other side is the vicious circle, which is like when you get low, you get lower, which is actually kind of very much in the design of capitalism. But this particular one was more the kind of comparison between the strengths and the weaknesses of having something like a token as a semiotic unit compared to, say, language. That it because you have something like language. Of course, you have other forms of communication as well, but I'm making this particular comparison to simplify things. And once you have language, but then you also have this value, you have more. But the value itself in this token-like manner is both has strengths because of this sort of quantity creates this nuance, and then maybe the main value is that it's able to translate all the things. So the cows and the teddy bears and the houses and the cars and whatever translate all potentially into tokens. So that's a strength. But then the weaknesses come from also the limitations of that. Then the number becomes, or the quantity becomes often too important because it has this sort of universal translative power. And then secondly, it's always, every system, no system is neutral. And tokens are always system-based because to actually have them, you have to kind of form these rituals of offers and whatnot, and no system designed in whatever way is neutral. So there is always a kind of something is favored over the other. To give a case, like a traditional problem of economics is something like teaching is harder to value because if somebody is doing something like selling a product that is more directly transformable into numbers, like I'm asking 500 euros for this. But if somebody's value was to teach all those people, it's a second order. It's like one step more. So recognizing their value is harder and not so apparent because it's actually their value was how they taught those people who now are making these offers. And this is why in economy universally something like teaching is undervalued. I mean, there's other reasons, of course, but that's a key one example of that. And that relates to this kind of semiotics that tokens bring in.
Can I ask another thing?
Sure.
I'm sorry to take so much time, but I have to soon hop off, so I'm trying to press in a bit. since I'm working at this kind of weird membrane between, or membrane between, say, discursive practices and spatial or material practices. One thing or like a term that I've been thinking about much or using or trying a lot is this codification. Would you say that what you describe as the kind of semiotic dimension of tokens could be kind of described in this term of codification? Would that be an appropriate update of the term, or because what I'm concerned with, to give it the backdrop for this, is matters that are not codified, active form, like spatial sensation, and so for me codified entities in my current conceptual model, they play a bit the antagonist to that. So I was just wondering if yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's a complicated question. It's opening another philosophical kind of worms. I can try to keep it short. Although I think these kind of larger philosophical questions are actually really good to come to, because one of the problems is that people think oh, money is money, and only by going through these sort of larger questions you can come to the point of what is actually what we're dealing with. But okay, this is a larger question in the sense that let's take a comparison to language. Language is ultimately also codification. It is like a very complicated sense of codification that we come to agree that, say, the word cat generally refers to these sort of creatures with this kind of a pattern. But it's complicated because also that codification has like an interpretative layer. Like it always goes through interpretation, and then it turns back and comes an argument or expression. That is like you can make your expression of a cat being used slightly differently, and then maybe go front with that because there is this interpretation layer, like back and forth. Like your expression is an interpretation, and then whoever is listening to it, that's also an interpretation. And when you look at tokens, they kind of actually want to do away with partially with this interpretation layer. So for example, if you're setting a price, like in this game currently on the screen, it's an expression to say that this particular tile for me is two tokens. That's an expression, but it's a kind of, it has a hard edge to it because it's kind of straightly in the system that there is a clear interaction that the other player must give 2 tokens, not 1, not 3, and that won't be interpreted. Their expression is limited. But there is still an expression layer, for example, in terms of setting the price. But then, like, the other player has to kind of follow that. So all of this is codification, but let's say the cloudiness or softness or ambiguousness of that codification is different. And I would very roughly say that the edges are harder once you come to quantification, as described just now. Okay, I'll move to the other example if there is no, because this was already, as usual, longer than I thought. I'll also check quickly. But luckily, I have handily the other example right here. So this is a page from a beta released game called Wanderhome. Now we're back to this wacky role-playing game side of things. But this one even has the word tokens here. So Wanderhome it's a game that is essentially a contemplation of the journey home, etc. It's a but the main point of interest here is that it introduces tokens in a very different way, but nevertheless as the main mechanic of driving that journey, but also the environment where the journey takes place, and also the actions of all the persons in a way in that taking that journey and around them which they meet. Now, I opened it on this page particularly because this is kind of the main summary of the token structure. It's not complicated, so we can go through this. But in this game, Wanderhome, it's based on an engine called belonging outside belonging. We don't have to go into that, but there's some other interesting games like Dream Askew, which ultimately started this engine. But I think this is actually in some ways a more crystallizing example. So you can see here. So think of that you are playing a character inside a world, but you can also become responsible for the environment or another person or any person inside the game. But like, because it can be an environment, it could also be responsible for the tower or the weather currently, or really anything that is defined. But while you're playing, you have tokens with you, and there is two sides of to the token, which is get a token and spend a token. So issuance and spending, essentially. So once again, issuance is kind of, which is for us excluded. We have nothing to do with the issuance of euros. It's kind of like outside of us, or very far from us. In all of these games, they are always designed hand in hand, and I think that is actually a good general sign in itself. But whenever, like, from your character, whether it's a person or even this environment, whenever you inconvenience yourself to help someone else, or you give away something you hold dear, or you pause for a moment and get some rest, etc. All of these are definitions, and this is actually, it's not explicated in this game and maybe not even seen by the designer, but what they're now doing is that they are at least intuitively understanding that the token is semantics. Because all of this, if you would write these definitions differently, the whole issuance would be different. Like if this you get a token every time you harm someone or are hurtful, it's a very different game. So here, this is setting a desire. Like, oh, if I inconvenience myself, or if I give away something I hold dear, I get back value. I get tokens. And then, of course, why would you get those tokens is related to how you can spend them, because they become a power. And here you can spend a token to provide a solution for an aspect or of a material or immediate problem, ease someone's pains only for a moment. Here, the sentence is slightly different because it says like you can express a solution, but if you also spend a token to it, it is a solution. If you try to ease someone's pain, say physical one, but if you spend a token, it is really more substantial. Keep someone safe from the difficulties of the world, some outside factors. If you spend a token, those outside factors are weaker. So these are the reasons of desire for you to get the tokens, and then you get the tokens by in largely altruistic senses. So these definitions written in a different way would always create a completely different token systems. And this is actually the main core of the token system. There are some other qualities, I can point to them later, but this is the thing that is the most important one, is that you have this back and forth, that you're, if certain people on a traveling journey are traveling and somebody finds a way to help somebody else, they will get a token, and that gives them more definition power, because the spendings are all about, like, I actually think this should be the solution. So Now I take one of my tokens and spend it, and then the other players will think, oh, now it's a solution because you put the token. Let's figure out how it actually solves itself. So your expressions become more powerful, and they define more how things are. So I could say a lot about this, but because we were quite long, I think useful, but long in the earlier case, I want to summarize from here to more go into conversation, is that actually here the token, whether intuitively or analytically or both, probably both in some ways, this is actually approaching the tokens from the social and semiotic. It is a system, sure, but it's like immediately turns into, yes, semiotic, but also social, because every one of the reasons why you get the token is a statement of defining what the social will be. You're creating social desire. And then similarly, how you spend the token is about your expression and its effect to the world, which is also social and semiotic at the same time. So it's kind of like if the earlier game was all about tokens as we conventionally know it, like euro, it was very much close in the same paradigm of how tokens are. Like it was trying to create value to make certain things possible, which is ultimately drive on the money. Like it's not just a bad structure. There's a lot of values in there that were ultimate, like democratizing early on, at least. Maybe not now. But here it's moved to these other sides of the token. It's moved to the social. It's moved to the semiotic first and foremost, and then the system actually comes kind of after those. So that's my short summary. I'll keep the rest of the issues from this on the back burner. But any comments on this?
This game sounds lovely. It looks amazing. Also, the website, like it's I don't know, it's just so subtle and yeah, looks absolutely lovely. This system of tokens feels, not quite entirely, but feels a lot closer to a mutual credit system.
Yes,
to me,
it is.
in the sense of how the issuance comes to existence, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I don't know if you can go into negative credit into this game. I assume no, but
no. Yeah, it's not mentioned even. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's so interesting, right? This completely two different ways of approaching value, and the other one feels a lot more cold, right? Like the tokens are sort of like external to your humanity in a way, or just like an instrument upon the world, whereas in this game the tokens are expressive, are an expression of your actions and your relations. I really like that.
Yeah, much more directly so. Like in a way, it's an expression to set a price to something, but it's in this sort of almost like an external system. It's like it's in a hardened ritual in the earlier game. It's this hardened ritual, but you can express yourself in that ritual, but only by setting a number. Like I put price of 1 or 5, or that's your expression. It's still an expression, but limited. Here, it's more nuanced and open up, like to possibilities of the social and expression in a wider sense. And because you kind of like you even start by expressing first, and then you almost load that expression with the token. But the expression can be really anything. Like you just say this is valuable to me. This is what you're saying. Like I'm now expressing something valuable to me. And that's why I'm spending a token on it. So yeah, one of the main reasons I wanted to bring this is kind of like if you're taking snapshot from a very wide field, of course there would be many others, but this gives a kind of almost like the other end, not like in a one dimension, but like we're in a very different part of the possibilities map of tokens with this structure.
Yeah, and it's interesting how it relates to things that we somehow have in our language, but not in our economy, or like just like in a immaterial economy. Like when we're saying, I give you credit for that, or this is good karma or something like that. Like we are kind of aware of these things, but we will never say like, I give you a token for this, and it's like really a token that the other person could then use in a way, in another way. Like
and really here it's like almost like it's different from words and concepts, but it's working alongside. It's much more closer to them. It's like you almost nest them in to the words and concepts or other expressions. It doesn't have to be language, but like it could be a movement, but you're nesting the token into those expressions. Like rather than having this separate system which allows for expression, but only in regards to that system in itself. I'm not saying this is good and bad. Like both have their strengths and weaknesses again, but this kind of side, which is actually in very much has its own strengths, is almost non-present, say, in crypto. Or like, well, your mention of mutual credit is a good one, because if I would raise from existing economies something, mutual credit would be very much on the top of the list. But also, I think it's like, put it this way, it kind of even highlights more some of these sort of semantic and social qualities, and also how important this definition of becomes, like, because like you almost have like a key element of the social of this world created by the game, decided by those sentences or expressions of what how you get a token or how you spend a token. There is other things in this game. Let me see. I have to go a few pages. Okay, I'll take this one. So I point this out because this is in collaboration with the token system. So every character or every player takes a character. In addition, they also play environment, etc., and so on. But the rooting point is the character, and the characters have this sort of different archetypes. But how you make the archetype is actually based on rights. Again, like referring back to the, of course, the tokens in themselves carry the rights, and rights are expressed by how you get it and how you spend it, and so like that. Once again, the Lego block works. But here it's say you choose to be a peddler. What it actually means, like you have this short description, but this is really up to you to interpret. Like your care is material, solid, and dependable because you're a kind of person who peddles stuff. But it's up to you how you interpret this. But you choose an animal, because everything is an animal in this game. You choose two you are and two you feel you need to be. So these are actually differently described, like for different players. Like here is choose two your job asks you to be, and two you actually are, and so on. Like, but for example, the peddler could be really are stingy or feels that they need to be stingy, or they could choose watchful as something that they are or need to be. So they select 4 of these. I mean, they could write others, but this gives this sort of basic system for this. But this kind of defines this archetype, almost like this filter that comes to existence. Oh, this is cancel. I have to just minimize it. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Now I have to. Hopefully, my sound is not doubled. Oh, it's Axeli.
Okay, cool.
Hey, hello, welcome. That's good that you came, because Eric is moving, and Martin had a baby. He was here actually, and so
okay.
we're. But I can bring you up to speed. So we're looking at our second example of economy, which is a not yet published, kind of semi-published game called Wanderhome, which has an interesting token model. Maybe I'll shortly show you just what we processed. This is 76. I'll go to the beginning and just quickly scroll. And there's Jonathan.
Yeah, sorry. That's why I in fact came, because we had a session here, but
can you have it elsewhere?
We can go to Jonathan's.
Okay, yeah.
Of course, no problem.
Yeah. So
let me.
I'll just quickly summarize it.
But summarize it.
Yeah. So in this game, it's essentially about contemplating journey, and your main route is a character of some kind, a person you are. But then you can also be an element in an environment, which could be a certain building or village or weather or something. Like, you're going to be all of those things.
Yeah.
But underneath it, there is a core token system. And the token system is very simple, but it forms a kind of a flow. And it's defined really here. I mean, there's other stuff, but this gives you the core. Like these two parts, you get a token.
Right.
And then it's defined like whenever you inconvenience yourself to help someone else, or when you give away something you hold dear, or there's other kind of conditions like pause for a moment and get some rest, and so on and so forth. Now, why would you get a token? What would be the desire? Is because there's the spend a token. So whenever you, for example, express something that you think is the solution for an aspect of a material or immediate problem, if you spend a token with it, it becomes more weighted. It becomes like, others have to think of it as a solution. Or if it's about keeping someone safe from the difficulties of the world, it means that the world has less power because you put token in it. So you have this constant flow, and everything that is defined here, if it would be defined differently, you would have a completely different sense of sociality. And why I like this design, it really crystallizes this sort of token design that starts from the social and also starts from the kind of semiotic, that everything is an expression. Of course, it's not the only way. There's a million ways to do it, but it's a good example how this can be practical. So it becomes exactly a social unit that creates a sense of a community, because everyone who is in these tokens is a community in itself, which is then weighted by the factors of which give a token or create a possibility of spending a token. But yeah, that's the.
I get it. And hey, sorry. Again, I really wanted to come. I just didn't have time for the beginning.
No problem.
Really nice to meet everybody here. Next week. I'll be here.
All right.
I'll be here. Okay. Yeah. Hey, John, can we go to your Zoom?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Can you send me the link? Okay.
Yes.
And bye.
Everybody, sorry to intrude. Okay.
No problem. So, okay, I'll see you later. Okay, I'll go back. So in addition to the sort of like personalities, there's the look, and there's a kind of things that you have, which is kind of items. Like here, it's like you have a beetle that carries your things, but then on that beetle you have flowers, tea, and anything beautiful yet fleeting. But you have to choose 4 of these. But then there is also qualities like choose one that you never abandon and one you parted with a long time ago, and then tell about them. So these are mostly kind of like actually tools and instrumentation of mostly kind of how do you flesh out the archetype to help you to not start from just a concept in itself. But and then this part, ask one to the left and one to the right. This is actually about, once again, opening the social, but in a different way. Like you ask from somebody else, how do I help you to decompress when the days are long? Or somebody, why did we start traveling together all those years ago? So while these are not tokens, they are in a similar design space. It's actually kind of creating these bonds by almost like predefining, but this sort of topic of a discourse, which is why are we connected? Beyond that, you have some things you can always do, which is now goes to rights even more directly. That like beyond the tokens, you have something more persistent. That you can always know someone who can help, or intensely examine something, or sit down and do the math, which is probably economy here. and then you have this sort of, that's another right in a particular situation context. But in a way, like this is kind of an additional element to this token economies here, which plays with that. But here I wanted to highlight this particularly for how the token's going to give you the right when you spend the token. So they're this sort of fluctuating things. And then you have certain things that are more persistent, like the rights here. And that actually forms its own play in and of itself. That what is more permanent becomes maybe more rooted to your person, and what is more token-like is more rooted to the moment. And what do you think in the moment? And how do you, in a moment, find that this is valuable for me, and therefore, or this is important for me, and therefore I express it, but also kind of make it valuable by the token. Any comments, questions?
This is amazing. Like this character creation, it's really interesting. Like it allows for introduces the past, some things that you might done before, like that allows for a certain type of depth, I feel, like in the decision making. But there's also like the potential, right? Like how would you, like this other side when you're creating the character, and this also when this asks to the left, asks to the right, so you allow others to have an influence on how your character behaves, right? So it sort of has this it's social at its core. That's really nice. And that would be very interesting in terms of organizations, how to articulate teams, right?
Exactly.
If you allow for others to sort of like help you define your tasks in this like very sensitive way.
Yeah, and also like you allow them to define you, but you also define them because the question in itself contains already something that is already defining them. And of course, you could write this. I mean, here they are made because it's always easier to make this, but like there's a kind of sometimes written, sometimes underwritten in this kind of games that you can also write your own, and then also towards the organization, writing them out is a way to think about what kind of relations the organization wants. So it really moves that element, not completely, but a certain part of that element and generation of that element into an expressional field or expressive field. And this becomes rather interesting, like, and why, one of the reasons I picked this was precisely that it has this quality of the social, like written in, which then essentially immediately connects it to organization, because it's not just defining social as vague loud, it's actually designing towards the kind of sociality it wants, both with the token and with this definition of a point of view, a perspective, because really the character is a point of view perspective. I'll quickly show.
Can you put a link to this? Do you have a link to this game?
Yeah, I'll put the links to this generally, like after to show how these or where this can be got. You can get the book is not yet published, but you can get the work in progress PDF, which is this, which is what you're looking at. So I'll show this last thing. So in addition, like why I said the character is a perspective is because you can, like I said, you can also play elements of the environment, and whether it's a weather or even a festival or whatever. And some of them are defined, and those don't have to be the only ones. But for example, here is a market, and just like the character, he has this sort of interpretational general description, but then it has rights. So somebody's playing the market, they can always, as a market, describe what people find in the market. reveal the consequences of theft. So if theft is happening, they have the right to define, reveal the consequence, or offer someone something they want at an affordable price. Give them a token if they refuse to offer, so it becomes also they get the right to issue. And then you can once again flesh it out by choosing 2 aesthetic elements, and then choose one folklore about this place, which is like they're almost like this sort of fairy tale titles, like the eel, demon, and the lootist. And now you have to define, but you have the right to define as playing the market of what is the story of the eel, demon, and the lootist. It's not defined elsewhere. So it's actually the same approach as the character because they're all just perspectives and all can be occupied. But they even though it's not explicated and maybe it's just intuitive, but they actually kind of design from the rights onward. They kind of realize that making something a source of rights, it kind of makes it more impactful, socially speaking, and the game also game-wise speaking. So this ultimately moves, even if there are practical differences, it moves the environment into the same realm as the characters. And some of them are also abstract, maybe the last comment. So while something like a market is very concrete, but there are some things that are treated as metaphorical. So the Hallow is a sacred place where gods and mortals mingle, but like if you read the whole game, it's also like it's not defined what a Hallow is. It's more like an abstract. Like if you find a place of sacredness, any place of sacredness could be a Hallow, and then once again you have this sort of similar way of fleshing out the perspective and it becoming a playable agent in, so to speak. So yeah, that's so all of this, of course, then plays through this core engine of the tokens. Like I wouldn't say the tokens are the most important. I think these are kind of about equal. It's kind of equal playing with rights and tokens as temporary rights, but they're very much designed in harmony and in how they play. But it's interesting to me how this is economical. In a way, it's just as economical as the Isle of Skye, the board game. Both had like other elements. You have rights to, and then you have tokens. And both of those elements actually are needed for the whole game to happen. But it's a very, very different way of designing towards those directions. All right. Any other comments, questions on this? Or anything you want to say? Or,
I do, but I feel I've been speaking a lot. Yeah, if you want to say something, please go ahead.
No, do say.
Yeah.
I was just, I don't know, like I find it really nice to see these both, and also, yeah, I imagine like that there are different economies possible also at the same time.
And of course, these are just snapshots. There are other possibilities, and really the selection of very different snapshots too, because it kind of also creates some kind of sense of the ground in between. Of course, it's a long distance, but then like one can imagine also things in between these two. My last thing, which might actually go to the next session, is actually a third kind of game, maybe closer to this one, or I would say very much closer to this one, and maybe a kind of influence that the writer of this game might not even know about because it's so unknown, but has probably like under the radar influenced this game, which is a game called Universalis, which was, I think, like around 2002, I think, And it had this sort of very much like how tokens are a semiotic system first and foremost. It's actually, I think it's less aware or less nuanced in its sociality, but it's not non-existent. It's like, because of the point is also like tokens actually always affect the sociality and create part of it, how much they affect, just like euros and dollars affect the sociality of our world. But it's maybe less nuancedly aware in its design. On the other hand, I think it has some interesting things about the semiotic aspects and how it, because it's the whole game is meant to almost start from nothing. Like there's nothing in the world, and then there's just right to speak or right to express and tokens. So just nothing else. But I think like that case, it's wider, but my idea was that I've extracted some of the key parts of the game and maybe kind of universalized them a bit because I think they need an update, but into playable forms. And I also translated them towards organizations that because the game is actually kind of like surprisingly close to organization even without knowing. So, for example, maybe I just sort of describe it and we can leave it to the next session. But for example, the starting point of the game is an open conversation with a certain amount. Everybody has the same amount of tokens. Like, of course, it could be different. Modularly would be defined whatever way, how many tokens and whatnot. But everybody has, I think, 10 tokens at the beginning. But you start with this open discourse, which might be, I would like to play with a world that has a lot of rivers and really is based on this sort of like a snaking rivers. And then somebody says, yeah, I think, yeah, I like the rivers. It could be this sort of lush, like everything is a forest of different kind and so on. Like the conversation goes on like that. But then at any point, anybody of the players could say, I'll take, let's say, the expression of every piece of land contains this sort of snaking or serpentine rivers coursing through it, and I put a token on it. And that changes it. Like you could roughly say from fact to fiction, but that would be maybe wrong, because it's like slightly more like turning it from almost like from ethereal to concrete. The ethereal is not nothing. Like all the discourse, all the conversation we have actually does affect the game. But because I put a token on this, it cannot be removed. It somehow exists in the world. Or we go more deeper into the game, people can challenge that, and maybe the rivers are lost by some reason, but that then demands more play in itself. Now that has solidified to the world. And then because people solidify different things, which can be really any expression, then you populate the world as this sort of almost like a network of different things, and then you can even populate it by creating sub details by adding other tokens. So like to the snaking rivers, I say like there are many types of watercolor in this world, and they vary in all rainbow hues, and I put another token. It's different, but it's also connected to my first one, and such create this sort of like a rising, in a way, rising hills of meaning. And I translated this into, if you start from imagining an organization from nothing, or maybe you have ideas because you have this free conversation, and you bring the ideas into that conversation. But then people can place tokens. And also, when somebody places a token, because it's a game or designed like a game, you can create an interaction there where somebody can say, oh, I don't like that. Can we reconsider? And you can give this sort of like a moment when the token is placed where it becomes a conversation. But if it passes the conversation, you can set some rules on it, maybe even voting or whatever. if it passes that, it becomes solidified. So you kind of created a pocket on that. And I made a very short experiment with that, and it actually became a really interesting way of approaching an organization, because it created topics of both importance, because people would place these tokens only to things that they thought were important for them and for the organization. And then it created these conversations around these topics of interest, and also created this mapping, more like a network or mind map or a graph-like presentation rather than a kind of paragraph of text. That was the first map of the organization in itself. There's other things, like the game itself then contains a possible, like how do you use tokens to create an event, like create a time flow. And you can then think, actually, in organizations, every project is a time flow. It's a way of creating organizational time or process, but it's the same thing. Time and process are ultimately the same thing. So yeah, so that is also very interesting, and I'll kind of leave that for later to describe how that works. But it's also a very different way of approaching something like, let's start this project conversation, and how do you define that project, because it becomes a mapping again, and it becomes a mapping in time, and what can you do with that, and so on and so forth. So that's my kind of proposal upon these topics, to go to playstorming, also because I think it has the possibility of turning into a micro game that would be quite decently easy to design. Like I've kind of or made the mechanics into a much more smaller package, and I think generalized them. So not only is the game in itself unknown, but also the mechanics from that could be different enough that certainly it's a very different game. And so if we test Playstorm around that, it could kind of open this avenue of, expressing or putting out this kind of a game of towards organizations. So yeah, that's kind of the continuation in the light of these examples that I was thinking to propose.
Do you plan it today still, or for next session? Because unfortunately, I have to.
Yeah.
Have had to be gone.
No, I was the reason why I was kind of expressing it that way, because I think it's realistically next session. I think like this, it was good that these conversations around this were longer, because then they were able to be chewed a bit. So I was essentially doing a semi-salesman job of also describing why next time is interesting, I guess. Yeah. So yeah, I just summarize it for like foreshadowing.
I'm convinced. I buy it. You get as many tokens as you want.
Yeah, I can give you the tokens, like in that game, because we can give the tokens to each other, so that and you can give them back. That's, by the way, in this game, the Wanderhome, it is also a meta-social factor that you're constantly giving and receiving to others, to other players. It has a social effect in itself, mostly positive, like because it's like you're showing signs of appreciation, and you're receiving signs of appreciation. Like it becomes a socially affirming ritual in itself.
I think I've had a micro epiphany regarding the difference between these two games and money and mutual credit. It also makes sense. Some people refer to mutual credit as mutual commitment. It sort of allows for a better understanding of the system. And I feel that relates to how when you put a token on something you say, you sort of like commit to it existing in the real world. Sort of like that makes sense to me. But I'm thinking, like in the other game where tokens are closer to money in its mechanisms, sort of like the token money defines a certain culture, right? How you
Yes.
interact, how you put up an offer,
Yes.
and it's very like linear in the way of how you can express yourself.
Yeah.
Whereas in this more mutual credit token system, the culture defines the token.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like a vehicle to articulate culture.
Yeah.
I assume in most games, in most Wanderhome games, it will, with different groups, interactions will be very different. Like tokens
Yes.
will be super particular to the group, to the setting. Whereas in the other game, most mechanics will replicate itself. Like it will be more similar among groups. No?
Yeah. Yes. Very much. Like I would put it this way. Like in both cases, the tokens are an instrument of culture, like in a very wide sense. But in the Wanderhome case, that instrument is moved next to, like in the nearness of the culture as a whole, and the also like expression of that culture, all of that. Whereas in the case of the Isle of Skye, but also money, it's moved rather to separate, to give it solidity, to give it the sort of stoniness that it stays, which is the quality that has been looked from it. But it also creates this like it's very much like a religious sacred thing. You know, there is an altar on the temple. You cannot sit on the altar, certainly. You cannot spit on the altar. You cannot speak loudly near to the altar. There's only a couple of things you can do with the altar, and most of the things you have to do only as a priest. So, like, you have maybe one or two chances to approach it, and you approach it this way and no other way. That's very much the quality, and I'm intentionally making this comparison because I think they come from the same roots, like the kind of sense of religion and sense of value systems in this way. So, like, you create solidity in this manner, but then because it's solid, it's it doesn't listen to the expressions. The expression have to listen to it. Whereas here, it's more, they are more in a dance. That the form is actually is nothing without the expression is open to them. The tokens, like they're kind of like shells that are fulfilled by the expressions, and even the shells themselves are made from expressions, like the definitions where how you get the tokens. So they're much more in a closer dance in this sense. Um, so like both are kind of cultural instruments and therefore effects that create the whole culture in and of itself. But like just like you said, they have a very different quality, and this quality is one of the bigger differences between these two examples. Any last comments? Anyone? Like, I think Dea has to leave soon, and I think we're at some kind of a point of an end of a journey, I guess, to refer to Wanderhome. Like I said, I'll put the links into the Telegram, etc. But if somebody has something to wrap up or last things to add, questions to leave for contemplation.
Thank you for sharing this.
Thanks for being here.
Get a token.
Yes, thank you. It's been amazing.
Both of you.
Yeah, it is interesting and also I think necessary because token is already like, even though it's changing by crypto, it's almost like trying to make new gods, like referring to the temple. It's trying to make new altars. It's trying to harden, and without actually really coming to this question of, well, it's a social thing. Why do we want this design? And this is why I think, I'll finish with this, I promise. Like, why these games are rather interesting way to open this fertility towards these topics, because if you're designing a game, it can only validify itself by the play. So you cannot make it into a sacred object. You have to actually kind of put the token or something token-like there because it helps with the whole design, it helps with the process, or it contributes to the process. I guess that's a good word for it. And that's the only way to put it in. And both of these games, Isle of Skye in a different way, and this game actually use them very efficiently or very also smartly to contribute to their own processes. Of course, one of the key things is Isle of Skye is about winning and losing. This is not. And Wanderhome is about contemplating journey. And this is one of the key reasons where that difference comes. But there's other reasons as well. So inside the games, you cannot rely on the sacred. In some ways, crypto is saying it's sacred also by stacking up all the value into Bitcoin is valuable because it's valuable, and therefore it has to be respected. Here you cannot do that, and that's why you have to open to the design. All right, that's my finish. And
Beautiful.
if nothing else, tape.
That was beautiful. We should leave it there.
All right, let's leave it there, and I'll stop the screen sharing, and then I'll stop the